The cold wind bit into us as we stood on VOL.03 Bridge, the ancient stone structure looming ominously in the twilight. Our group, just 5 of us, had decided to visit this infamous place during our travels through Scotland. We had heard the stories, the tales of dogs inexplicably leaping to their deaths from the bridge, the whispers of something dark lurking in the mist that often enveloped the area. But we had laughed it off, intrigued rather than frightened, dismissing it all as local folklore. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and a thick fog had started to roll in, curling around the trees and slowly swallowing the landscape. It was the kind of night where every sound seemed amplified, every shadow lengthened and twisted into something sinister. "It's colder than I expected," Sarah muttered, wrapping her scarf tighter around her neck. I nodded, shoving my hands deeper into my pockets, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to seep into my bones. We were all standing in a tight group, not out of fear, but because the darkness made the bridge feel smaller, more isolated. Tom, always the jokester, leaned over the edge, peering into the abyss below. "Do you think we'll see one of those ghostly dogs tonight?" he asked, a grin plastered on his face. His voice echoed slightly, carried away by the wind. "Don't jinx it," Katie replied, her voice barely a whisper. She had been uneasy ever since we arrived, her usual bravado replaced by a quiet tension. We stood in silence for a while, the only sound being the distant rushing of the river far below. The fog was thickening, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The trees on either side of the bridge were little more than dark shapes in the mist, and the road behind us had disappeared entirely, swallowed by the fog. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A shadow, darker than the rest, shifting in the mist. I turned to look, but it was gone, leaving only the swirling fog in its wake. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "See what?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with concern. "Over there." I pointed towards the end of the bridge where I thought I'd seen the shadow. "I saw something, or someone." Tom laughed, though it sounded forced. "Maybe the overtuned ghost will come to say hello." But as we all turned our gaze to the end of the bridge, the laughter died in our throats. There, standing just a few feet away, was a figure. A shadowy figure, barely discernible in the fog, its form flickering in and out of view like a weak signal on an old television. We froze, none of us daring to speak. The figure was motionless, staring down into the river below, though it was hard to tell if it was facing us or away. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud and heavy in the stillness of the night. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It was slow, almost graceful, as if it were drifting rather than walking. It approached the edge of the bridge, and for a moment, I thought it might be another person, maybe a local out for a late-night walk. But there was something wrong, something deeply unsettling about the way it moved, like it wasn't fully attached to this world. And then it jumped. It happened so quickly that we barely had time to react. One moment it was standing there, the next it had leaped off the bridge, plummeting towards the dark waters below. We rushed to the edge, our breaths caught in our throats, expecting to hear the splash as the figure hit the water. But there was no splash, no sound at all. We looked down, and there it was, still there, hovering in the air, just a few feet above the river, as if caught in a loop, eternally falling but never reaching the ground. "What the hell?" Tom's voice was barely audible, his usual bravado completely gone. We stared in horror, unable to comprehend what we were seeing. The figure was still, its limbs outstretched as though frozen in the act of jumping, but it wasn't moving. It was as if time had stopped for it, trapping it in that moment of despair. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, and my hands began to tremble. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing seemed real anymore. This wasn't a ghost story. This wasn't some legend. It was right in front of us, impossible to deny. Sarah was the first to move, taking a hesitant step back from the edge. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We shouldn't be here." Slowly, we backed away from the bridge, our eyes never leaving the figure that still hung there, suspended in midair. The fog had thickened even more, the mist curling around the figure, almost as if it were trying to pull it back into the river. As we turned to leave, the figure began to fade, slowly dissolving into the mist until it was gone. The relief was short-lived, though, as the air grew colder, and an eerie silence settled over the bridge. No one spoke as we hurried back to our car, the once light-hearted atmosphere now heavy with an unspoken fear. As we drove away, none of us could shake the image of that shadowy figure, frozen in its eternal fall. The road seemed longer than before, the trees pressing in on either side, and the fog refused to lift. It was as if the bridge, or whatever haunted it, had left a mark on us. A darkness that would follow us wherever we went. I had heard the stories, of course. Everyone who visits the Stanley Hotel does. But I wasn't there for ghost hunting. I was there for a conference, something dull and forgettable. When I checked in and they handed me the key to room 214, I didn't think much of it. The number didn't ring any bells, and I wasn't about to get spooked by a number. The hotel had an old-world charm, like stepping back in time. The wood-paneled walls, the grand staircase, even the creak of the floorboards. They all whispered of a history too deep to fully grasp. But as I walked down the hallway to my room, a chill crept up my spine. I dismissed it as the mountain air seeping through the drafty corridors. Room 214 was at the end of the hall, secluded, almost forgotten. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by a rush of cool air that was unusual even for the hotel. The room was cozy, with a 4-poster bed and vintage furniture that looked like it had been there since the hotel's opening. The windows offered a view of the mountains, their peaks hidden by thick clouds. The first thing I noticed was the feeling of being watched. It was subtle, just a prickle at the back of my neck, but enough to make me glance around. The room was empty, of course, but the sensation lingered, like someone was standing just out of sight observing me. I shook it off. This was an old building. It was probably just the atmosphere. As the evening wore on, I tried to settle in. I unpacked, attended a few conference events, and returned to my room early, eager for some rest. But the moment I closed the door behind me, the room seemed to come alive. The air felt charged, like before a thunderstorm, and the silence was thick, oppressive. I turned on the TV, hoping for some background noise to drown out the unease creeping up on me. But the channels wouldn't cooperate. The screen flickered, static crackled, and the picture distorted, showing brief glimpses of old black and white images. People in old-fashioned clothes, a man's face twisted in agony, a woman standing still, staring directly at the camera. Then, just as suddenly, the TV turned off by itself, leaving the room in deafening silence. I told myself it was just a technical glitch, nothing to worry about. But the feeling of being watched had intensified. It was no longer a subtle prickle, but a heavy weight pressing down on me. I looked around the room, my eyes drawn to the corner where the shadows seemed darker, denser. There was nothing there, of course. Just shadows. But the air was thick with something I couldn't name. I tried to brush it off, to act like it didn't bother me. But my heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to go to bed early, hoping that sleep would come quickly, and this unsettling feeling would vanish by morning. But as I lay down, the bed felt strange, as if it had been slept in recently. The sheets were cold, not in the way that freshly laundered linens are, but in a way that suggested they had absorbed the chill of a body that wasn't mine. I pulled the covers up, trying to ignore the odd sensation. The room was silent, but it was the kind of silence that felt loud, like it was filling up the space, pressing in on me. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind outside seemed amplified. I closed my eyes, trying to will myself to sleep. But the moment I did, I felt a shift in the air, like something had moved. I opened my eyes, and there, at the foot of the bed, was a figure. It was indistinct, more of a shadow than a person. But it was there, standing, watching. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure didn't do anything, just stood there, a dark shape in the dim light. I blinked, and it was gone. The room was empty again, but the feeling of dread remained, clinging to the air like a thick fog. I sat up, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. I didn't sleep much after that. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, every nerve on edge, waiting for something else to happen. The hours dragged on, and the room felt colder, darker, more oppressive with each passing minute. I heard faint sounds, footsteps in the hallway, a soft knock at the door, a whisper that I couldn't quite make out. But when I got up to check, there was no one there. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of my alarm. The room was filled with early morning light, the kind that should have brought warmth and comfort, but the coldness from the night before lingered. I packed my things quickly, eager to leave. But as I reached for the door, I hesitated. There, on the nightstand, was a small, old-fashioned key. I hadn't noticed it before, and I certainly hadn't placed it there. It was tarnished with age, but there was no mistaking its purpose. It was a room key, like the one I had used to enter. But this one was different. It had a number etched into it, 214. I picked it up, feeling its cold, heavy weight in my hand, and a chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone had left it there as a prank. But as I closed the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. A reminder, perhaps, that some things in this hotel were beyond explanation, beyond understanding. I checked out as quickly as I could, not even stopping for breakfast. As I drove away from the Stanley Hotel, I glanced back at the building, its imposing structure looming against the backdrop of the mountains. And for a brief moment, I thought I saw something in one of the windows, a dark figure, standing still, watching me leave. I didn't stay to find out. I've always been a sucker for strange places. The older, the more obscure, the better. So when I stumbled upon the old library at the edge of town, I couldn't resist stepping inside. The place had no business being open that late at night. The sign above the door was faded, the windows dark, but when I pushed the heavy door, it creaked open easily, as if it had been waiting for me. The interior was a far cry from the modern libraries I was used to. The shelves were towering, filled with dusty books that seemed as ancient as the building itself. A faint, musty scent hung in the air, the kind of smell that made me think of forgotten things, memories lost to time, secrets buried in pages no one had read in years. There was no one at the front desk, no librarian in sight. It struck me as odd, but I brushed it off. Maybe they had just stepped out. I wandered deeper into the library, my footsteps echoing off the marble floor. The place was massive, far larger than it appeared from the outside. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched endlessly, disappearing into the shadows. I pulled a book from one of the shelves at random, wiping away the layer of dust that had settled on the cover. The title was faded, barely legible, but the weight of the book in my hands felt significant, as though it carried more than just words inside. I opened it, expecting the usual musty, yellowed pages. But what I found was different. The pages were crisp, as if they had just been printed, and the ink was fresh. The story, though, it was strange. It was about a man walking into an old library late at night. The description eerily familiar. The more I read, the more it felt like I was reading about myself. As I flipped through the pages, the details became more specific, too specific. It mentioned my hesitation at the door, the way I had wiped the dust from the cover of the book. My heart began to race. I wasn't imagining this. The story was unfolding exactly as it had happened. I snapped the book shut and put it back on the shelf, trying to shake off the creeping dread that had settled over me. I needed to leave. But when I turned to head back to the entrance, I couldn't find it. The rows of shelves seemed to have shifted, creating a maze that I didn't remember navigating before. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the layout of the library couldn't have changed. But no matter how many turns I took, I couldn't find my way out. The shelves stretched endlessly in every direction, the shadows growing deeper and darker the further I went. I started to panic. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the library itself was watching me. I tried to focus, to think logically, but every time I thought I had found a familiar landmark, it would vanish as soon as I got close. The more I searched, the more I realized there were no windows, no clocks, nothing to indicate the passage of time. My footsteps grew frantic as I stumbled into another section of the library. This time, the books on the shelves were different. Their covers were pristine, and the titles were written in a language I didn't recognize. But I couldn't resist the pull. I grabbed one, my hands shaking as I opened it. The words on the page seemed to blur and shift as I read, but the story was unmistakable. It was me again. Only this time, the story continued beyond the point where I had closed the last book. It described my frantic search for the exit, the rising fear that something was terribly wrong. It even mentioned the exact book I was holding in my hands at that moment. I dropped the book, backing away from the shelf. My breathing was shallow, my skin cold with sweat. I had to get out of there. I began to run, weaving through the shelves, turning corner after corner, but no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't escape. The library was endless. I wasn't alone anymore. I could hear whispers now, faint at first, but growing louder with every step. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't friendly. The shadows between the shelves seemed to shift and move on their own, and I felt eyes watching me from every darkened corner. I stopped running, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to think. There had to be a way out. But as I stood there, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then, I saw it. A book sat on a pedestal at the center of a clearing between the shelves. It wasn't dusty, or old like the others. It was new, the cover gleaming in the dim light. My name was embossed on the spine in gold letters. I approached it slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. I didn't want to open it, but I knew I had no choice. I had to know. The pages were blank at first, but as I flipped through, words began to appear, scrawling across the paper as if being written in real time. The story picked up right where I was standing, describing me opening the book, my fear, my confusion. But then it began to describe something else, something that hadn't happened yet. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. The book detailed how I would turn around and see something. My eyes darted to the next line, but the page ended abruptly, leaving me hanging in the middle of the sentence. I dropped the book and spun around, expecting to see some unspeakable horror. But there was nothing, just more shadows, more empty space. But I knew I wasn't alone. Whatever was there, it was waiting. I tried to force myself to move, to keep going, but my body felt frozen, trapped by the weight of the story unfolding around me. I was a part of it now. Just another character in a library that never closed, in books that never ended. I'm still here, wandering through the shelves, trapped in a maze of endless stories that write themselves as they happen. Every time I try to leave, I find myself drawn back to the books, compelled to see what happens next. But I already know how it ends. It doesn't.